everyone, welcome back to Ways of the World, a brief global history with sources. We're going to conclude our study of colonial encounters in Asia, Africa, and Oceania with believing in belonging, identity, and culture change. So let's start with education. Getting a Western education created a new identity for many. The almost magical power of literacy, the escape from obligations like forced labor, access to better jobs, and social mobility and elite status all accompanied education, Western education. Many people embraced European culture. It created a cultural divide between them and the vast majority of the population. Many of the Western educated elites saw colonial rule as the path to a better future, well, at least at first. In India, they organized reform societies to renew Indian culture, and hopes for renewal through colonial rule were disappointed. The educated elite. So throughout the Afro-Asian world of the 19th century, the European presence generated a small group of people who enthusiastically embraced the culture and lifestyle of Europe. Here, King Chulalongkorn of Siam poses with the crown prince and other young students, all of them impeccably garbed in European clothing. How could a historian use this image to explain the relationship between European colonial powers and native elites? Well, native elites adopted Western dress, evident in this image, and likely Western language and customs to differentiate themselves from other natives and thus create a small native elite, socially located between the Europeans and the non-Westernized natives. Religion. Widespread conversion to Christianity in Pacific Oceania and non-Muslim Africa also transformed identities. Around 10,000 missionaries had gone to Africa by 1910. By the 1960s, some 50 million Africans were Christian. Many oceanic elites strengthened their position by association with Christianity. Missionaries made huge gains in oceanic societies that were devastated by newly arrived diseases. Christianity was attractive to many in Africa. Military defeat shook belief in their old gods, and Christianity was associated with modern education, gave opportunities to the young, poor, and many women, and Christianity spread mostly through native Africans. There are conflicts over issues that touched on gender roles and sexual norms. Female nudity offended Western ideas, polygamy contradicted Christian monogamy, and what should male converts do with additional wives? There's bride wealth, sex outside of marriage, and female circumcision that are all part of these social norms that contradicted Christianity. Christianity was Africanized. They continued the use of charms and medicine men, and some simply demonized their old gods. And there's a wide array of independent churches that were established, and Christianity did not spread widely in India, however, but it led intellectuals and reformers to define Hinduism. And a new definition of Hinduism helped distill a clear sense of Muslims as a distinct community. The missionary factor. Among the major change agents of the colonial era were the thousands of Christian missionaries who brought not only a new religion, but also elements of European medicine, education, gender, roles, and culture. Here's an assembly at a mission school for girls in New Guinea in the early 20th century. How would a historian use this image to explain the impact imperialism had on culture and gender roles in colonial societies? The Caucasian missionaries shown here are bringing two concepts to New Guinea that did not significantly exist there previously: Westernized education for women and Christianity. All right, Vivekananda, a Hindu monk in America. The modern colonial era is associated with the westernization of the peoples of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Less frequently noticed has been traffic in the other direction as Eastern and especially Indian religious culture penetrated Europe and the Americas. In his cabin on Walden Pond in the 1840s, Henry David Thoreau remarked, quote, "In the morning I bathe my intellect in the stupendous philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita, in comparison with which our modern world and its literature seem puny and trivial," end quote. A more seminal moment in the coming of Indian spirituality to the United States occurred in Chicago during September 1893. The occasion was the World's Parliament of Religions, an interfaith gathering that drew representatives from many of the world's religious traditions. The man who made the most vivid impression at the conference was a handsome 30-year-old Hindu monk shown here, known as Swami Vivekananda, appearing in an orange robe and a yellow turban and speaking fluent and eloquent English. He had only recently arrived from India, where he had received an excellent European education as well as a deep immersion in Hindu philosophy and practice. In his initial speech to the Parliament on its opening day, he declared, quote, "I am proud to belong to a religion which has taught the world both tolerance and universal acceptance. We accept all religions as true." End quote. He concluded with a plea that the Parliament might mark the end of sectarianism, fanaticism, and persecution by stating that, quote, "between persons wending their way to the same goal," end quote. In further speeches at the Parliament and in subsequent travels around the country, he expressed the major themes of his modernized Hindu look: that all human beings possess a divine nature, that awakening to that nature can be pursued through a variety of paths, and that spiritual practice and realization are far more important than dogma or doctrine. He argued that the disciplines of the mind and body that derive from Hindu tradition represented a psychological, experimental, and almost scientific approach to spiritual development and certainly did not require conversion to an alien faith. On occasion, he was sharply critical of Christian missionaries for the emphasis on conversion. He said, quote, "The people of India have more than religion enough. What they want is bread. The most prosperous Christian nation in the world with her foot on the neck of 250 million Asiatics." He emerged from the Parliament in a sensation and a celebrity, widely acclaimed but also widely criticized. His critique of Christian missionaries offended many. More conservative Christians objected to his assertion of the equality of all religious traditions. Quote, "We believe that Christianity is supplant all other religions," end quote, declared the leading organizer of the Parliament. In Vivekananda's time in the United States represented India speaking back to the West. After a century of European missionary activity and colonial rule in his country, he was declaring that India could offer spiritual support to a Western world mired in materialism and militarism. He proclaimed, quote, "The whole of the Western world is a volcano which may burst tomorrow. Now is the time to work so that India's spiritual ideas may penetrate deep into the West," end quote. In exposing Americans to Indian spirituality, his followers did not seek converts, but invited participants to apply Hindu principles and practices with their own religious traditions. They also spoke about Jesus with great respect and displayed his image along with that of the Buddha and various Hindu sacred figures. In the early 20th century, these ideas attracted a modest following among Americans who were disillusioned with the superficiality of modern life as well as with the rigidity of Christian doctrine and the many divisions and conflicts among Christian churches. In the 1960s and later, interest in Eastern religion exploded in the West as hundreds of Indian teachers arrived, many of them bearing the same universal message that Vivekananda had presented in Chicago. The growing numbers of Americans who claim to be, quote-unquote, spiritual but not religious are following in the path of that orange-robed monk. Race and tribe. So notions of race and ethnicity were central to new ways of belonging. By 1900, some African thinkers began to define an African identity. They united for the first time by the experience of colonial oppression, and some argued that African culture and history had the characteristics valued by Europeans, complex political systems, for example. And some praised the differences between Africa and Europe. In the 20th century, such ideas reached a broader public. Hundreds of thousands of Africans took part in World War I. Some Africans traveled widely. For most Africans, the most important new sense of belonging was the idea of, quote-unquote, tribe or ethnic identity. Ethnic groups were defined much more clearly thanks to Europeans, and Africans found ethnic identity useful. All right, Charles Titchin, Commandant Marchand across Africa, 1900. So this is source 18.1. It's the cover of a French publication, and it shows the commander of the French expedition, Jean-Baptiste Marchand, who gained heroic stature by leading his troops on an epic journey across much of Africa for more than 18 months. So how did the artist portray Marchand, and how might a British artist have portrayed him? Marchand is portrayed as a heroic knight, as an intrepid explorer and leader. A British artist might have portrayed him as an ambitious usurper, seeking to challenge British claims to territory. As an armed invader of British territories, as the man that the British intimidated into acknowledging British claims along the Nile, or perhaps as an intrepid explorer whose success led him to wandering beyond French territory. Notice the large number of African troops among Marchand's forces. What does that suggest about the process of colonial conquest? Why might Africans have agreed to fight on behalf of a European colonial power? A large number of African troops suggests that colonial conquest was accomplished in part by using the resources of the empire and by the participation of Africans. Africans might have fought on behalf of a European colonial power for personal gain, in alliance with Europeans against other African enemies, and because the Europeans forced them to fight on their behalf or out of loyalty to a European empire. The Rhodes Colossus, From Cape to Cairo, 1892. In this famous image criticizing or celebrating Rhodes' Cape to Cairo dream, explain your reasoning. Or is this famous image criticizing or celebrating? I'm sorry, I worded that incorrectly. Well, you might make the case that it is celebrating Rhodes, as his larger-than-life figure could be interpreted as confident in showing the way to British success, as portraying him as an intrepid adventurer with rifle, as portraying him as a colossus, right, the original being of one of the ancient wonders of the world, or as portraying him as a visionary represented by the telegraph line that he holds. You might also argue that the image criticizes Rhodes, depicting him as a larger-than-life figure with his head literally in the clouds, symbolizing the impossibility of his vision. Africa below his feet shows the huge distance between Cairo and Cape. If the artist had intended it to look less daunting, he could have outlined current British imperial holdings between 2 points. And it also describes Rhodes as a colossus, comparing him to the original Colossus of Rhodes, which toppled over in antiquity. How did the artist portray the African continent? What does the absence of African people suggest? The artist depicts Africa as a geographic space without any hint of human habitation or the existence of indigenous African states. All of Africa, including the Sahara, is illustrated in a green tone, implying its fertility and richness. The absence of people implies that Africa was not occupied or developed, nor did people have a pre-existing claim on the land, and was therefore open for settlement by Europeans. All right, 1805. This is source 1805. Empire building in North Africa. British and French in North Africa, circa 1910. In North Africa, the primary European rivalries for territory involved Great Britain, which occupied Egypt in 1881, France, which came to control Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, and Italy, which seized Libya in 1912. Portrays two of these rivals, Britain on the right and France on the left, toasting one another while standing on piles of skeletons. This image appeared on the Cairo Punch, a British-owned magazine in Egypt, published in Arabic, probably around 1910. The image refers specifically to two incidents. On the British side, the cartoon evokes a 1906 quarrel between British soldiers hunting pigeons and local villagers that resulted in the death of one of the soldiers. In response, outraged British authorities hanged several people and flogged dozens of others. The following year in Morocco, French civilians building a small railway near the harbor of Casablanca dug up parts of a Muslim cemetery, quote-unquote, churning up piles of bones, end quote. When attacks against European laborers followed, killing 8, the French bombarded the Arab quarter of the city, with many casualties, Europe and Arab alike, in the fighting that ensued. Both incidents stimulated nationalist feelings in these two North African countries. What references to the incidents described in the introduction can you find in the image? Well, in Denshway, for the British, the pigeons or perhaps doves flying near the village, the man hanging from the gallows, the British soldier with a whip in hand signifying the floggings, the village labeled Denshway in the background, Casablanca, the skeletons that the French and British soldiers stand upon, the dead man in traditional Arab dress lying upon the skeletons represents the loss of life in skirmishes and the bombardment of the Arab quarter. And Casablanca, labeled on fire in the background, reflects the French bombardment of the Arab quarter of the town. Now, the British and French generally saw themselves as rivals in the scramble for Africa, but how are they portrayed here? Here, it looks as though they are portrayed as allies, toasting their respective repressive acts. From a North African perspective, this makes sense as Europeans across the region were seizing political control using similar means. What attitude toward colonial rule does this image reflect? Well, the artist remains unknown. Do you think it more likely to have been an Egyptian or a European? The image is clearly critical of colonial rule. It highlights brutal acts undertaken by colonial powers, including the shelling of Casablanca and the execution and flogging of villagers in Egypt. It highlights culturally insensitive acts undertaken by colonial powers, with its reference to the desecration of a Muslim cemetery. The evidence indicates that it was drawn by an Egyptian and that it is critical of European colonial regimes and portrays the French and British as allied in the process rather than competitors. And that concludes our study of Chapter 18. And this concludes Believing and Belonging, Identity, and Culture Change. I'll see you guys next time.